For most of my life, I believed silence was a form of peace. I believed that if I spoke less, listened more, and endured quietly, things would somehow fix themselves. That belief followed me into my old age, into the walls of the house I bought with decades of sweat, and finally into the slow betrayal that came from my own blood. The house was never just bricks and cement to me. It was my proof of survival. Every wall carried the weight of overtime shifts, missed holidays, aching bones, and dreams postponed for later. I remembered the day I signed the papers, my hands shaking, not from fear, but from pride. I told myself, this will always be home. No matter what, I raised my daughter here. I watched her learn to walk on these floors, fall, cry, and stand again. I paid for her education, defended her mistakes, and forgave her silences when she stopped calling as often. When she asked to move back in for a while, I didn't hesitate. Family, I believed, was forever. At first it felt right. She cooked dinner, laughed loudly, filled the house with life. But slowly something shifted. She stopped asking. She started telling. Furniture was moved without my permission. My room became temporary. Bills stopped coming to me. And somehow, without a single argument, I became a guest in my own home. I noticed the change, but I didn't speak. Silence had always been my armor. When I asked gently about the bills, she rolled her eyes. When I mentioned my name wasn't on the mail anymore, she laughed. "You worry too much," she said. Her tone wasn't cruel, just dismissive. That hurt more. Days passed, then months. I stayed quiet while my presence shrank. My chair at the table disappeared. My opinions were ignored. Conversations stopped when I entered the room. And still, I said nothing. I told myself this was temporary. That children forget sometimes. That patience would fix everything. The night it truly broke me came without warning. I returned home later than usual, tired from work, my joints aching in protest. I put my key into the door and turned it. Nothing happened. I tried again. Still nothing. Confused, I stepped back and checked the number. It was my house. It had always been my house. I knocked. After a long pause, the door opened just enough for her face to appear. She didn't look surprised. She didn't look guilty. "There's been a change of locks," she said calmly. I laughed, thinking it was a joke. "Why?" She shrugged. "It's easier this way." I stood there, holding a bag with my lunch container still inside, realizing something had ended. Not loudly, not violently, just quietly, like everything else. "You can't do this," I said softly. She crossed her arms. "I can. And you won't do anything about it." That sentence stayed with me. I slept in my car that night. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I stared at the ceiling and felt something harden inside my chest. Not anger, clarity. For the first time, I understood the truth I had been avoiding. My silence had not protected me. It had invited disrespect. Still, I remained quiet. People later asked why I didn't confront her, why I didn't call the police, why I didn't scream. They didn't understand. Silence had been my language for so long that breaking it felt unnatural. But silence does not mean surrender. Sometimes it means observation. Sometimes it means planning. They mistook my silence for weakness. That was their first mistake. What they didn't see was the quiet fire beginning to burn, slow, controlled, and unstoppable. And this was only the beginning. The morning after I slept in my car, the world looked the same, but I wasn't. People walked past me on the sidewalk carrying coffee, talking on phones, complaining about small inconveniences. No one knew that a man who had built a home with his bare hands no longer had a place to shower, to rest, to breathe in peace. I went to work as usual. I washed my face in the restroom, straightened my shirt, and looked at myself in the mirror. My reflection didn't show anger. It showed disbelief. The kind that settles deep and stays quiet. I told myself this is temporary. I had been telling myself that for months. Blood. That word had always meant safety to me. It meant loyalty without contracts and love without witnesses. I grew up believing that family was the one place the world couldn't reach you. But sitting there, staring at my tired eyes, I realized something painful. Blood connects bodies, not values. After work, I returned to my house, not to force my way in, but to retrieve a few clothes. I knocked again politely. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't threaten. I simply asked. She opened the door wider this time, confident now. Her tone had changed. It wasn't defensive anymore. It was authoritative. "You should find somewhere else to stay," she said, as if giving friendly advice. "I just need my things," I replied. She sighed dramatically. "Why are you making this difficult? You're my father. This shouldn't be about property." That word, property, fell from her mouth like an insult, as if the house had simply appeared out of thin air. As if decades of sacrifice meant nothing once emotions shifted. "I paid for this house," I said quietly. She smiled, not warmly, strategically. "You can't evict family." There it was. The sentence she believed was a shield. She repeated it often after that, to neighbors, to relatives, to anyone who would listen. Each time it grew stronger in her voice, as if repetition could turn it into law. Family meetings followed. People I hadn't heard from in years suddenly had opinions. They told me to let it go, to forgive, to remember that she was my child. "She's young," one said. "Be the bigger person," another advised. "Money and houses ruin families," they warned. No one asked where I was sleeping. I stayed quiet through it all. Not because I agreed, but because I was learning. I listened carefully. I noticed who defended her without knowing the facts. Who avoided eye contact? Who changed the subject when I mentioned the lock? I learned that loyalty is loud when it's convenient and silent when it's costly. One night, I sat alone in a cheap rented room, staring at the ceiling fan as it clicked unevenly. I replayed her words over and over. "You can't evict family." She believed love was a weapon, that my role as a parent meant permanent surrender. That was when the truth finally settled in. Being a parent does not mean accepting injustice. Love does not require self-destruction. I began gathering papers quietly, deeds, tax receipts, utility bills, years of proof that my silence had not erased my ownership. Every document felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing. Not my friends. Not my relatives, not even myself out loud. I moved carefully, like someone learning how to walk again after a fall. When she found out I had spoken to a lawyer, she laughed. "Go ahead," she said over the phone. "You'll lose. Judges don't break families apart." I didn't argue. I thanked her for her time and ended the call. What she didn't understand was this: families are not broken by boundaries. They are broken by entitlement. And sometimes the kindest thing you can do for yourself and for them is refuse to be mistreated. Blood may create connection, but belonging is built on respect. That night, for the first time in a year, I slept deeply, not because things were better, but because I had finally stopped lying to myself. The silence remained, but it was no longer weakness. It was resolve. There are moments in life that divide everything into before and after. You don't recognize them when they arrive. They don't announce themselves. They slip in quietly, like an ordinary day pretending to be harmless. The day I was locked out was one of those moments. It began like any other. I woke before sunrise, my body already tired, my mind running through the same thoughts it had been circling for months. Work, bills, silence. I made my coffee, stood in the kitchen I paid for, and watched the steam rise as the house slowly woke around me. My daughter passed by without a greeting. I told myself not to read into it. By the time I left for work, the house no longer felt like mine, but it was still familiar. The walls held echoes of laughter, arguments, birthdays, and quiet nights. I didn't know I was saying goodbye. Work dragged on endlessly. My phone buzzed once during lunch, but when I checked it, there was no message. Just a missed call from a number I recognized. I considered calling back, then decided against it. Silence had become our language. When evening came, I drove home on autopilot. The sky was heavy with clouds, the kind that promise rain but never deliver. I parked in the same spot I had used for years, grabbed my bag, and walked toward the front door. I remember noticing how quiet the house looked. No lights on, no sound, just stillness. I put the key in the lock. It didn't turn. At first, I thought I had the wrong key. I tried again, slower this time. Nothing. I wiggled it, pressed harder, then pulled it out and stared at it like it had betrayed me. My hands began to shake, not from fear, but from confusion. I knocked once, then twice. The door opened just enough for her to look at me. She was calm, too calm, like someone who had rehearsed this moment. "What changed the locks?" she said. "No apology, no explanation, just a statement." I waited for the rest of the sentence. It never came. "Why?" I asked. She sighed as if I was the inconvenience. "This living situation isn't working." I laughed softly, the sound escaping before I could stop it. "This is my house." She looked at me then, really looked at me, and in her eyes I saw something unfamiliar. Not anger, not guilt, confidence. "You'll figure something out," she said. "You always do." The door closed. I stood there longer than I should have. Long enough for the neighbors to glance through their curtains. Long enough for the weight of the moment to settle into my bones. I didn't knock again. I didn't shout. I simply turned around and walked away. That night, my car became my bedroom. The seat didn't recline far enough. The air was cold. Every passing vehicle felt like a reminder that I didn't belong anywhere. I stared at the dashboard and replayed every conversation we had ever had. I searched for the moment where I failed, the moment I should have spoken louder, sooner, differently. Regret tried to take control, but something inside me resisted. This wasn't just about a lock, it was about erasure. Inside that house were my documents, my clothes, my memories. Photographs of her as a child, letters from my parents, proof that I had existed long before she decided I didn't matter. In the morning, I went to work without sleep. My body moved mechanically. My mind stayed at that door, frozen in the moment it closed. People spoke to the first few weeks after I was locked out, passed in a blur. Days melted into nights, and nights into early mornings where sleep never truly came. I found a small room to rent, cheap, temporary, forgettable. It smelled of damp walls and old paint, but it had a bed and a lock that worked. That was enough. I told myself I would stay there for a month. Just until things cooled down, just until she realized what she had done. A month became 3, 3 became 6. Before I realized it, a full year had passed. In that year, I learned how loud silence can be. I didn't argue with her. I didn't beg. I didn't threaten legal action. I barely spoke to her at all. When relatives asked what happened, I said, "We're giving each other space." It was easier than explaining betrayal to people who only wanted a simple story. Inside, something else was happening. Every morning, I woke up early. I worked longer hours. I stopped spending money on anything unnecessary. No small comforts, no indulgences. Everything had a purpose. Pain became discipline. Humiliation became fuel. At night, I sat at the small desk in my rented room and organized my thoughts like paperwork. I replayed events not with emotion, but with precision. What was said, what was done, what could be proven. I wasn't angry all the time. That surprised me. Anger burns fast and leaves you empty. What I felt was steadier, heavier. A quiet fire that warmed my resolve instead of consuming it. Sometimes doubt crept in. Late at night, when the room was too quiet, I asked myself if I was being too harsh. She was still my daughter. I remembered holding her when she was sick, teaching her how to ride a bike, promising her the world. Then I remembered the door closing. That memory never softened. I checked on the house from a distance. Friends told me she had redecorated, changed the curtains, painted the walls. She spoke of the place as if it had always been hers. She told people she was taking care of things now, and they believed her. I said nothing. People often misunderstand silence. They think it means acceptance, or fear, or weakness. They don't realize that silence can be a strategy, that it gives you time to observe while others reveal themselves freely. In that year, she revealed everything. She stopped pretending it was temporary. She stopped asking permission for anything. She acted like ownership had transferred simply because I stepped aside. She even joked once at a family gathering that I was too soft to fight back. Everyone laughed. I smiled politely. Inside, the fire burned brighter. I began documenting everything: dates, conversations, witnesses. I saved messages, took notes after phone calls, collected proof quietly, carefully, legally. I learned the difference between emotion and evidence. There were nights I wanted to confront her, to remind her who paid for her education, who worked double shifts so she could have choices. But I knew that would only give her what she wanted: reaction, drama, noise. Instead, I gave her nothing. That year changed me. I learned that dignity doesn't come from being liked. It comes from respecting yourself enough to draw a line, even when it hurts. Especially when it hurts. I learned that love without boundaries becomes permission, and permission, when abused, turns into control. Most of all, I learned patience. Not the passive kind that waits and hopes, the active kind that prepares. By the time the year ended, I was no longer the man who stood outside his own door in disbelief. I was organized, focused, ready. I knew exactly what I would do next and when. She still thought she had won. She still believed my silence meant surrender. The quiet fire had done its work, and soon it would be time for the world to hear what my silence had been saying all along. By the time I decided to act, everyone around me had already written my ending. In their version of the story, I was the aging father who gave up quietly, the man who chose peace over confrontation because he was too tired to fight. They spoke about me in the past tense, as if I had faded into the background of my own life. And I let them believe it. Silence gives people confidence. When you don't respond, they fill the space with their own assumptions. They assume victory. They assume control. They assume you are done. My daughter assumed all of that. She walked through the house as if it were hers by birthright, not by my patience. She made decisions without hesitation. She rented out one of the rooms for extra money. She replaced furniture I had bought with things she liked better. She told neighbors she was handling family property issues, a phrase that sounded official enough to end questions. I heard these things secondhand. Each detail was like a match tossed onto the quiet fire inside me. But I didn't rush. Rushing is what weak people do when emotions lead. I had learned to wait. One afternoon, I ran into her at a grocery store. She looked surprised to see me, then amused. She glanced at my clothes, at the tired lines on my face, and smiled with a familiarity that felt like ownership. "You look fine," she said. "I told everyone you'd manage." I nodded. "I always do." She leaned closer and lowered her voice. "You know, people are saying you might try something legal. Don't embarrass yourself. You can't evict family." There it was again. The sentence she treated like a spell, like repeating it enough times would make it true. I didn't argue. I didn't correct her. I simply looked at her calmly and said, "Take care of the house?" She laughed. "Don't worry. I am." That laughter followed me all the way home. What she didn't know was that while she was decorating and celebrating, I had already spoken to professionals who didn't care about family drama. Lawyers who dealt in facts, not feelings. People who had heard every excuse, every emotional appeal, every manipulation. They didn't ask why she was my daughter. They asked whose name was on the deed. I had prepared for this moment carefully. Every document was organized. Every timeline was clear. I presented my case without emotion, without blame, just truth. The lawyer looked at me and said something I will never forget. "Silence doesn't weaken a case. Lack of evidence does. And you have plenty." That was the moment I knew the story was about to change. Still, I said nothing publicly. I didn't warn her. I didn't announce my intentions. I let her continue believing she was untouchable. Overconfidence is a gift when your opponent doesn't see it coming. She became bolder. She spoke more openly. She told relatives that I had moved on. She even suggested selling the house someday, as if the idea itself proved her authority. No one challenged her, and I didn't correct them. The notice was served on a quiet afternoon. No confrontation, no raised voices. Just an envelope delivered by someone with no emotional attachment to the situation. She called me immediately. "You did this?" she demanded. "Yes," I said. "You can't do this?" she snapped. "We're family." "I know," I replied. "That's why I waited." The line went silent. For the first time in a year, I heard uncertainty in her voice. The confidence cracked. The spell failed. They had mistaken my silence for weakness. They had confused patience with fear. They had believed that kindness meant surrender. They were about to learn the difference. And the next chapter would take place in a room where emotions carry no weight, only truth does. The courtroom was colder than I expected, not just in temperature, but in feeling. The air carried no sympathy, no history, no memory. It didn't care that I was a father or that she was my daughter. It didn't care about birthdays celebrated in that house or sacrifices made in silence. The courtroom cared about one thing only: truth supported by law. I arrived early. I always had. Preparation had become my habit, almost my comfort. I sat on a hard wooden bench and watched people come and go, each carrying their own version of desperation. Some argued loudly. Some cried. Some stared straight ahead like me. When she walked in, I barely recognized her. She was dressed carefully, confidently. She had practiced this moment in her mind many times, I was sure. Her posture said she believed this was a misunderstanding that would soon be corrected in her favor. She didn't sit next to me. That distance spoke louder than any words we might have exchanged. Her lawyer arrived shortly after. He looked relaxed, almost bored. To him, this was just another case. To me, it was a year of quiet fire walking into daylight. When the judge entered, everyone stood. The room fell into instant silence. Not the heavy, emotional silence I had lived with, but an authoritative one. The kind that demands respect. The judge reviewed the case calmly. No theatrics, no impatience. Just measured attention. My daughter spoke first. She talked about family, about misunderstandings, about emotional conflict. She said she had never intended to take the house, only to protect it. She explained how difficult it had been dealing with an uncooperative parent. She painted herself as the responsible one, forced to act. As she spoke, I watched the judge's face, unmoved. Then it was my turn. I stood slowly. My knees protested, but my voice didn't. I didn't raise it. I didn't accuse. I didn't attack her character. I simply told the truth. I explained how I bought the house, how my name alone was on the deed, how I had allowed her to stay temporarily, how the locks were changed without my consent, how I was denied access to my own property. I presented documents, deeds, tax records, utility bills, each piece placed on the table like a brick returning to its rightful place. The judge examined everything carefully. Her lawyer tried to interrupt, tried to shift the conversation back to family dynamics, to emotions, to moral obligations. The judge raised a hand. "This court does not decide family feelings," he said calmly. "It decides legal rights." That sentence felt like oxygen. My daughter spoke again, this time less confidently. "You can't evict family," she said, almost pleading now. The judge looked directly at her. "The law does not recognize a family as a reason to occupy property without consent," he replied. "Ownership does not dissolve because of blood relation." The room went quiet. I felt nothing dramatic, no triumph, no anger. Just relief, slow and steady, like pressure releasing after being held too long. The judge continued, explaining the decision in clear, unemotional terms. "The house belonged to me. She had no legal right to remain. A timeline was set. Proper notice was confirmed. You must vacate the property," the judge said. Just like that, no shouting, no judgment of character, no lecture on respect or love, just law. My daughter stared forward, frozen. The confidence she carried in had vanished. For the first time, she looked like a child who had been told no by someone she couldn't argue with. As we left the courtroom, she tried to speak to me. I stopped and looked at her. "This didn't have to happen," she said. "It happened the day you changed the locks," I replied quietly. I walked away. Outside, the sunlight felt different, brighter, not because I had won, but because I had stood without lowering myself. I had spoken when it mattered, and I had let silence do its work until then. Justice doesn't roar, it speaks calmly and expects you to listen. The judge's words followed me long after I left the courtroom. "You must vacate the property." They were simple, almost ordinary, yet they carried the weight of an entire year, of nights spent staring at unfamiliar ceilings, of mornings waking up without a home, of being erased from a place that carried my name. I didn't celebrate. I didn't call anyone. I sat alone in my car for a long time, hands resting on the steering wheel, letting the moment settle. Victory, I realized, doesn't always arrive with joy. Sometimes it arrives with clarity. Word traveled fast. Family members who had once advised me to let it go suddenly wanted details. Some called to congratulate me. Others called to ask how things had gone so wrong. A few avoided the subject entirely, as if silence could now protect them from discomfort. I answered politely, briefly. I had learned that explanations are rarely worth the effort once people have chosen their side. My daughter didn't move out immediately. She delayed, asked for extensions, tried to negotiate through others instead of speaking to me directly. Her messages were careful now, measured, restrained. The confidence had been replaced with calculation. "You didn't have to involve the courts," she wrote. I read the message twice, then set the phone down. There are words that reveal more than the speaker intends. Didn't have to meant she still believed the decision belonged to her, that my suffering had been optional, that justice was excessive when it worked against her. I didn't respond. The final notice date arrived quietly. No drama, no confrontation. A moving truck appeared early in the morning. Neighbors watched from behind curtains, curiosity replacing the certainty they once had. I stood across the street, not to supervise, but to witness closure. She avoided my eyes. Furniture I remembered buying was carried out and loaded up. Some of it damaged, some of it replaced, some of it gone entirely. I felt a brief sting, but it passed. Things can be replaced, boundaries cannot. When the house was finally empty, the silence returned. But it was different now. It no longer felt oppressive. It felt earned. I walked inside for the first time in over a year. The air was stale. The walls were unfamiliar. It looked like my house wearing someone else's choices. But beneath the changes, it was still standing, still mine. I opened windows, let the light in. That night, I slept in my own bed again. The ceiling fan hummed the same uneven rhythm it always had. I lay there awake, listening, feeling something close to peace, but not quite. Forgiveness is complicated. People assume winning a legal battle resolves everything. It doesn't. The law restores property. It doesn't restore trust. It doesn't rewind time or undo what was said behind closed doors. I thought about calling her, about saying something that might soften the ending. But every version of that conversation ended the same way, in compromise of my own boundaries. So I stayed silent. Weeks passed. I repaired what needed fixing, reclaimed what could be reclaimed. Slowly, the house began to feel like mine again, not because of ownership, but because I occupied it without fear. One evening, I found an old photo tucked into a drawer she had missed. It was of us, years ago, smiling in the front yard. I stared at it for a long time, then placed it back where I found it. Some memories don't need to be destroyed. They just need distance. The words that changed everything were spoken by a judge, but the real change happened inside me. I no longer believed love required sacrifice without limit. I no longer believed silence meant invisibility. Strength doesn't announce itself. It stands quietly when tested. And the final chapter would not be about revenge, but about what remains after justice has been served. Power doesn't always shift with noise. Sometimes it moves so quietly that people only notice once everything feels different. That was how it happened for me. Not in the courtroom, not with the judge's words, but in the days that followed when the world began responding to me in a new way. People who once dismissed my situation now spoke carefully around me. Their advice stopped, their opinions softened. Some apologized indirectly, using phrases like, "What, didn't know the whole story." Others tried to rewrite the past, pretending they had supported me all along. I let them. Power isn't proven by correcting others. It's proven by no longer needing validation. My daughter reached out again, this time in person. She stood at the gate one evening, hesitant, unsure of her place. That alone told me everything. She was no longer certain, no longer protected by assumption or sympathy. "I just want to talk," she said. I listened. She spoke about stress, about pressure, about how things had gotten out of control. She didn't apologize, not fully. She framed her actions as mistakes, not choices. She said the house situation had blurred boundaries. I nodded. When she finished, she waited, perhaps for forgiveness, perhaps for me to soften, to reassure her that everything would go back to how it was. "It won't," I said calmly. Her eyes widened slightly. "What can have a relationship?" I continued, "but not the one we had. That one depended on me staying silent." She looked away. Power had changed sides, not because I took something from her, but because I had taken myself back. I no longer needed her approval. I no longer needed to be understood by everyone. I needed only to be respected. That shift unsettled her. In the weeks that followed, I noticed changes in myself. I spoke more directly at work. I said no without explaining myself. I took up space without apologizing for it. The man who once avoided conflict had learned something better, discernment. The house, too, began to reflect this change. I repainted walls in colors I liked, rearranged rooms to suit my life now, not my past. Each decision was small, but together they formed a declaration. I was no longer living around someone else's comfort. Late one night, sitting alone in the living room, I realized something unexpected. I wasn't angry anymore. Not at her, not at the family who had doubted me, not even at myself. Anger had done its job. It had pointed me toward truth. Now it could rest. Power, I learned, is not control over others. It's control over yourself, over what you accept, what you tolerate, and what you walk away from. She called less often. When she did, the conversations were careful, respectful, short. The dynamic had shifted permanently, and that was necessary. Some people can only love you when they feel powerful over you. When that power disappears, so does the illusion. I didn't regret my choice. I regretted only that it took me so long to make it. Standing in my doorway one evening, watching the sun set across the yard, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: ownership that went beyond property. Ownership of my voice, my space, my life. The final chapter would not be loud. It would not accuse or defend. It would simply state the truth that had been waiting all along. Silence is not weakness, unless you let others use it against you, and I never would again. In the end, there was no dramatic finale, no final confrontation. No moment where everyone gathered to admit they were wrong. Life rarely offers that kind of closure. What it offers instead is something quieter and far more honest. Time. With time, the house settled back into itself. The walls stopped feeling like they were holding their breath. The rooms no longer echoed with tension. I moved through them slowly, deliberately, relearning what it meant to feel at ease in my own space. Every small routine, making coffee, opening windows, locking the door at night, felt like a reclaimed right. I thought often about silence, about how it had shaped my life, both for better and for worse. Silence had helped me survive difficult years. It had kept the peace. It had allowed me to endure. But silence, I finally understood, is a tool, not a virtue. Used wisely, it protects. Used blindly, it invites harm. For a long time, I had believed that being gentle meant being invisible, that love meant yielding, that patience meant waiting forever. Those beliefs nearly cost me my dignity. My daughter and I settled into a distant, careful relationship. We spoke on birthdays, on holidays, sometimes not even then. There was no open hostility, just a boundary that neither of us tried to cross. I wished her well, sincerely. But I no longer carried responsibility for her choices. That was the hardest lesson of all. People asked me if I would do anything differently. The honest answer was yes, I would have spoken sooner. Not with anger, not with threats, just with clarity. Clarity is kindness. Silence without clarity is confusion. I shared my story once at a small gathering. When someone mentioned a similar situation, I didn't dramatize it. I didn't villainize anyone. I simply said this: being family doesn't give someone the right to take from you. And standing up for yourself doesn't mean you love less. It means you finally love honestly. The room went quiet. I knew then that the story had reached beyond me, that it mattered. One evening, I found myself standing at the same front door where everything had changed. I placed my hand on the lock, not to test it, but to acknowledge it. A simple object, a powerful boundary. I smiled, not with satisfaction, but with understanding. Strength doesn't shout. It doesn't threaten. It doesn't rush. Strength prepares, strength waits. Strength acts when the time is right. They mistook my silence for weakness. I mistook my silence for kindness. We were both wrong. What I learned and what I carry forward is this: you can be compassionate without being passive. You can be patient without being powerless. And you can love your family without surrendering yourself. My story isn't about eviction. It's about voice. It's about dignity. It's about knowing when to stop being quiet. Because when strength finally speaks, it does so softly and it is heard.